The winter of 1923 had settled over Chicago like a shroud, heavy with frost and the dull gray pallor of endless snow. The city's streets were lined with soot-stained buildings, their chimneys coughing smoke into a sky that rarely saw the sun. Down near the river, in a neighborhood where the air smelled faintly of coal and cabbage stew, the gates of St. Agnes Orphanage creaked open for the last time that day. A young nun, her breath misting in the cold air, waited for the final intake. Before locking them for the night, she did not expect what she saw. From the fog emerged a small figure, thin, barefoot despite the icy wind, wearing a faded cotton dress far too light for the season. Her hair was pale, almost white, tangled in strands that caught the lamplight. She moved with a strange stillness, not shivering, not rushing, her bare feet leaving no prints in the crusted snow. Clutched in her hands was a warm wooden box, no larger than a loaf of bread, its surface carved with patterns too intricate for a child's toy. The nun later claimed she felt an odd pressure in the air as the girl approached, as if the night itself were holding its breath. The child did not speak. She simply stopped in front of the gate and looked up with eyes so light they seemed almost colorless, an unsettling shade between gray and ice-blue dot. No record showed who brought her there. No carriage was seen. No parent or guardian signed her in. The paperwork was filled in later, in the orphanage's tidy handwriting. Name, unknown. Estimated age, 9 years. Foundling. They gave her a new name, Annabelle Gray, and a small bed in the dormitory beside the frost-covered window. From the first night, strange things began. Children who had been sick with winter fever woke the next morning feeling well, their coughs gone as if they had never been ill. Others reported vivid dreams in which Annabelle stood beside their bed, watching them with an expression that was neither kind nor cruel, only intent. The older girls whispered that her hair seemed lighter by the day, as though it were losing color, or perhaps reflecting light that wasn't there docked in the orphanage's main office. Sister Margaret, the matron, placed Annabelle's wooden box into the locked cupboard where the children's small possessions were kept. But twice in that first week, she found the box sitting neatly on the girl's bed, the lock to the cupboard unbroken by the second month. The nuns noticed that Annabelle's skin never flushed from the cold. She did not sweat in the summer heat. She ate, but never seemed hungry. She slept, but never looked tired. Most unsettling of all, the calendar pages kept turning, and yet the girl's face never changed. Her cheeks stayed round with childhood, her limbs slight, her voice high and clear. Other girls arrived and grew older, their hair lengthening, their features sharpening. Annabelle remained exactly the same dot in the summer of 1924, a physician. From the city visited St. Agnes as part of an annual health inspection. When he examined Annabelle, he frowned, checked her pulse twice, and asked for her file. Sister Margaret retrieved it from the cabinet, but when they opened the folder, the pages inside were blank, not missing blank. The physician assumed a clerical error and filled out new notes by hand. 2 days later, his office reported that all the records from St. Agnes' most recent inspection were missing. No one had broken in. The files were simply gone. The physician didn't return the dossier. Next year, in fact, he didn't return at all. His obituary in the Chicago Daily Tribune stated that he had died in his sleep, peacefully, of natural causes, despite being only 38 and in perfect health. Time, in the way it does, kept moving. The children who had shared the dormitory with Annabelle were adopted, or aged out and found work, or vanished into the streets. The city roared through the year's prohibition raids, the St. Valentine's Day massacre, red lines in the Depression, and yet within the orphanage walls, Annabelle was always there, always 9, always the same. Sister Margaret lived long, enough to see the other nuns come and go, to watch the gas lamps replaced with electric bulbs, to hear the rumble of automobiles replacing the clatter of carriages outside. She also lived long enough to see that the girl never left the grounds, not once. Annabelle never attended school outside, never went on trips into the city, never even joined the supervised walks. Whenever she was invited, she simply declined, her voice soft and steady, her hands folded in her lap. There were whispers, of course. Some of the younger nuns speculated she was an angel, sent by God to watch over the orphanage. Others, more privately, muttered about the old stories their immigrant grandmothers had told of changelings, of spirits that took on the shape of children. No one dared confront her directly. Those who tried stern caretakers or skeptical visitors often fell ill soon after. The most unnerving incident came in the winter of 1931, when a fire broke out in the East Wing. Smoke filled the dormitory halls, the heat driving nuns and children to the frozen courtyard in their nightclothes. Sister Margaret, coughing and frantic, realized Annabelle was missing. She turned toward the blazing wing, and there the girl stood, framed by the flames, her cotton dress unstained, her hair untouched by the smoke. She walked calmly through the fire, eyes fixed on the matron, and stepped into the courtyard without a single scorch on her skin. Witnesses spoke of it in hushed tones for years afterward. But when the fire report was filed with the city, no mention was made of Annabelle. In fact, her name did not appear anywhere in the records. No attendance rosters, no census lists, not even in the monthly church reports. It was as if she existed only within the memory of those who had seen her. And as time passed, even those memories seemed to fade, becoming vague and dreamlike, like something half-remembered from childhood. By the early 1940s, most of the original staff of St. Agnes were gone. Those who had worked there in the early years were either dead or had moved far away. New nuns arrived, and for them, Annabelle was simply part of the furniture, a quiet, pale child who never caused trouble. They did not notice she was always the same age, because, somehow, they never thought to compare her to the passing years. And yet, somewhere deep in the bowels of the orphanage, in a storage room no one entered, the wooden box remained. Its carvings were no longer dull with age, but seemed sharper, the lines more pronounced, as though they had been cut yesterday. No one could explain how it got there. No one ever opened it. And perhaps most disturbingly, no one ever asked why, but time would ensure that the mystery could not stay hidden forever. Chicago was changing again, and soon the orphanage and Annabelle's secret would come under the scrutiny of people who did not frighten so easily. By the summer of 1945, Chicago had emerged from the shadow of war. Soldiers returned home, factories shifted from building tanks to producing washing machines, and the city seemed to hum with a new optimism. But behind the brick walls of St. Agnes Orphanage, nothing felt different. The peeling paint, the smell of starch and candle wax, the quiet shuffle of children's footsteps, it was as if time had stopped entirely. And for one girl, it truly had. Annabelle Gray still occupied the narrow bed by the frost-scarred window, though the frame had been painted twice since she first lay there. She wore the same style of uniform dress, hemmed to the same length, her pale hair neatly combed every morning. Her skin still carried that peculiar absence of change, no freckles from the sun, no small scars from childhood scrapes. She was as perfectly preserved as she had been the day she arrived. And for those who had been there long enough to remember 1923, it was impossible to ignore. But there weren't many of those left. The turnover at St. Agnes had been unusually high in recent years. New nuns arrived, took one look at the crumbling building and the strange atmosphere that seemed to cling to it, and quietly requested transfers within months. Those who stayed long enough to notice anything unusual about Annabelle rarely spoke of it, because when they did, something happened Sister Margaret had been the last of the old guard, the last living witness to the girl's arrival. In 1946, she began telling a young novice about the night Annabelle appeared barefoot at the gates. That evening, while polishing silver in the kitchen, Sister Margaret collapsed without warning. The doctor listed the cause, heart failure. She had been in good health that morning, that the novice to whom she'd been speaking left the orphanage the next week, without explanation. By now, the outside world had begun to brush against St. Agnes in ways it never had before. City inspectors were tightening their oversight of orphanages. Journalists were sniffing out stories of neglect, and charities were making unannounced visits. It was on one such visit, in the spring of 1947, that a reporter named Daniel Whitlock first saw Annabelle. Whitlock had come to write a human interest piece about post-war adoption rates. He was young, observant, and not easily distracted by polite smiles or rehearsed tours. When he stepped into the main hall, his eyes immediately caught on the small figure standing apart from the other children, her pale gaze fixed on him. Later, in his notes, he wrote, "She looked at me like she'd seen me before. No smile, no fear. Just recognition." When Whitlock asked Sister Agnes, the current matron, about the girl, the answer was oddly vague. "Annabelle Gray," she said after a pause. "Been here some years now." She could not, or would not, produce a birth date. When pressed, she claimed the original records were misplaced during the Depression. Whitlock's instincts told him there was more. He began asking questions, subtle ones at first, then more direct. How old was Annabelle? Why was she still at the orphanage when other children her age had been placed? Why was there no school record? Within a week of his visit, the Chicago Daily Times ran his article. It was a charming, surface-level story, the kind of soft feature editors liked. Smiling children, hard-working nuns, generous donors. Annabelle's name appeared only once, buried in the middle of a sentence. There was no mention of her strange, unchanging face. 3 days after the piece went to print, Daniel Whitlock's body was found floating in the Chicago River. Police ruled it an accident. Perhaps he'd been drinking near the docks and fallen in. But those who knew him swore he was not the type to drink alone, and never by the water. Back at St. Agnes, the story of his visit faded into silence. That summer, something began to stir within the orphanage itself. Several of the older children started whispering about the East Attica place kept locked for decades. On windless nights, they claimed to hear scratching noises from inside, or the faint sound of something rolling across the wooden floor. More than once, someone saw Annabelle standing at the base of the attic stairs, staring upward as if listening. One boy, curious beyond reason, tried the attic door one afternoon and found it ajar. Inside, he discovered dust, discarded furniture, and, in the farthest corner, a single shelf holding an old wooden box. The same one Annabelle had carried the night she arrived. He didn't touch it. Something about the air in that corner felt heavy, almost alive. He backed out slowly, pulling the door shut behind him. By evening, the lock had been replaced. Same night, the boy developed a sudden fever. His skin turned grayish, his eyes glassy. Doctors called it pneumonia, but he had been perfectly well that morning. Within 2 days, he was gone. No one mentioned the attic again. The pattern was becoming too sharp to dismiss. People who showed too much interest in Annabelle, or in the things connected to her, met swift, inexplicable ends. Whether by illness, accident, or quiet disappearance, they were erased from the world almost as efficiently as her paper trail. Still, a few staff members noticed small, unsettling details. A crucifix in the hallway that always seemed to tilt when Annabelle passed. The way stray cats, so common in the neighborhood, never crossed the orphanage gates. The frost that formed on her dormitory window in winter and lingered there even in July. And then there were the dreams. Children reported them. Most often, visions of standing on a vast frozen lake, Annabelle at the far end, her feet bare against the ice, her expression calm as she reached out her hand. Some woke with nosebleeds. Others spoke of a hollow ringing sound in their ears that lasted all day. In 1949, a new city welfare inspector arrived for an unannounced visit. He was meticulous, well-read, and had a reputation for uncovering irregularities. Within 2 hours of his arrival, he had already asked 3 separate staff members about Annabelle, remarking on her peculiar lack of growth. By the next week, he had fallen from a streetcar and broken his neck. The official report called it a tragic accident. Inside St. Agnes, the children learned quickly. Some questions were not meant to be asked. But outside, change was coming. The neighborhood around the orphanage was shifting, the old buildings giving way to modern apartments, the city council pushing for reforms. New eyes would soon be on them, eyes that might not be so easily turned away. And Annabelle Gray, forever 9 years old, seemed to be waiting for that moment. By 1951, the city around St. Agnes Orphanage had transformed almost beyond recognition. The cobbled streets were paved smooth, the old gas lamps replaced with humming electric fixtures, and the narrow brick row houses that once surrounded the orphanage were being torn down to make way for sterile, modern apartment blocks. From the outside, St. Agnes looked like a relic from another century, a stubborn fragment of an older, darker Chicago. But inside, nothing had changed. Annabelle Gray still occupied her same bed in the dormitory. The same pale hair, the same stillness, the same unblinking gaze that made new arrivals uneasy. To those who had been there, more than a few years rare as they were, it was undeniable. The girl had not aged a single day since her arrival nearly 3 decades earlier. Few spoke of it aloud anymore. Too many had learned what happened to those who did. That year brought new attention to the orphanage, this time from the archdiocese itself. A visiting bishop, known for his interest in revitalizing church institutions, arrived for a formal inspection. Accompanied by aides and a city photographer, he walked through the halls, blessing children as he went. When his gaze fell on Annabelle, he stopped mid-step. Witnesses later described his expression as one of recognition, though none could explain how he might have known her. He asked her name, and she answered in that same steady, quiet voice, Annabelle Gray. The bishop's lips pressed into a thin line. He nodded, offered a blessing, and moved on. The next morning, before leaving Chicago, the bishop insisted on reviewing St. Agnes historical records. The matron brought out boxes of Files birth certificates, adoption papers, ledgers. But when he asked specifically for Annabelle's intake documents, there was nothing. No file, no entry in the 1923 register, no photographs. The bishop left, without a word. 3 weeks later, news reached the orphanage that he had died suddenly while visiting Rome. The cause was listed as massive cerebral hemorrhage. He was 50-6. The photograph taken during his visit to St. Agnes never appeared in church publications. In fact, it vanished altogether. Meanwhile, the attic whispers began again. One of the new boys claimed to hear footsteps pacing back and forth above his dormitory at night. Another said he had seen Annabelle standing outside the attic door after curfew, her hand resting on the doorknob as if she were listening for something. It was the new janitor, a middle-aged man named Patrick Heller, who made the mistake of investigating. One afternoon, while repairing a leaking pipe in the east wing, he found the attic door unlocked. Dust hung in the air like smoke, and the only light came from a small window crusted with grime. In the far corner sat the same shelf the boy had seen years earlier, and upon it the carved wooden box. Heller swore later, to the few who would listen, that the box was warm to the touch despite the frigid air. Its carvings seemed to shift slightly when he stared at them, the patterns rearranging into shapes that made no sense. He left it where it was, but in the days that followed, he felt a growing unease. At night, he dreamed of a frozen lake stretching to the horizon, with a small figure waiting at the center. On the 5th night after his discovery, Patrick Heller failed to report for work. The police found his body in his apartment, sitting upright in a chair, eyes wide open, as if he had been startled awake. The coroner wrote, "Cardiac arrest," on the certificate, though Heller had no history of heart trouble. Back at St. Agnes, the attic door was once again locked. Annabelle remained unchanged. That winter, Chicago was gripped by an unusually harsh cold spell. Pipes froze, the lake iced over at the shoreline, and even inside the orphanage, frost crept across the glass in delicate white veins. One morning, Sister Agnes entered the dormitory to find Annabelle standing barefoot by the window, her breath not misting in the air. The frost pattern on the glass behind her resembled concentric circles, radiating outward from the exact spot where she stood. The nun told no one. She simply stepped back, closed the door, and began avoiding the girl entirely. But something was shifting, not in Annabelle's appearance, but in her presence. The children spoke of waking in the night to find her standing beside their beds. She never touched them, never spoke, only watched. Those she visited often woke the next morning feeling unusually tired, sometimes with small bruises on their wrists or ankles. One boy, braver than the rest, claimed he had spoken to her during one of these visits. He said she leaned close and whispered words he could not understand, syllables that felt heavy in his mind. The next day, his voice was gone. The doctor called it acute laryngitis, but weeks passed before he could speak again, and when he did, he refused to say what she had told him. The few remaining staff members who had been at St. Agnes for more than a decade began to notice another pattern. The weather inside the building seemed to respond to Annabelle. Rooms she spent time in grew inexplicably colder. Candles flickered without a draft. In the laundry room, water in the basins froze overnight, despite the boilers running full dot. No one dared confront her dot by the end of 1953. Rumors of the girl who never aged began leaking beyond the orphanage walls. They appeared in whispers, at neighborhood bars, in late-night conversations between policemen and reporters. A woman who had worked in the laundry years earlier told her sister that she had once seen Annabelle's reflection in a window moved differently than her body dot. It was inevitable that such whispers would eventually reach someone determined enough or reckless enough to investigate Dot in the spring of 1954. A private researcher named Howard Levin came to Chicago to document unexplained phenomena for a series of magazine articles. He had traveled across the Midwest, chasing stories of haunted houses, prophetic dreams, and strange disappearances. When he heard about Annabelle, he knew at once this was the kind of story his readers craved. But Levin didn't just want rumors. He wanted proof, and he had no idea how much St. Agnes and Annabelle protected its secrets. Howard Levin was not the kind of man who believed everything he heard. Years of chasing small-town legends had taught him that most so-called mysteries could be explained away with superstition, coincidence, or a good dose of human deceit. But the whispers about the girl at St. Agnes were different. There was a consistency to them, a peculiar lack of embellishment. No one claimed she was a ghost, or a demon, or an angel. They simply said she never aged. Dot Levin arrived in Chicago in April 1954 with a battered leather briefcase, a box camera, and a small notebook filled with names of people who had once worked at St. Agnes. He began by interviewing those who were willing to talk: former nuns, retired cooks, even a few ex-residents who had been adopted decades earlier. What he found unsettled him. Each account was nearly identical. Annabelle Gray had been 9 years old when they first saw her, and she had been 9 years old when they left. Her hair was pale, her eyes light, her skin untouched by time. Some remembered her carrying a small carved wooden box. Others recalled her aversion to leaving the orphanage grounds. A few hesitated before speaking, lowering their voices as they admitted to a feeling dread, fascination, or a strange pull whenever she was near. But more troubling was the silence. For every person who agreed to speak with him, there were two who refused, often with a polite but firm shake of the head. Several scheduled meetings were abruptly canceled. One elderly woman who had worked as a seamstress at St. Agnes told Levin, "You don't want to know about her," and hung up before he could reply. Levin kept pushing. His persistence eventually brought him to the orphanage gates. The building loomed against the spring sky, its bricks darkened by decades of soot, its windows clouded with grime. He knocked, introduced himself to the matron, and requested permission to tour the facility for an article about Chicago's oldest orphanages. The matron, a severe woman with thin lips, agreed, though her eyes flickered briefly. When he mentioned he wanted to speak with the children, it was during that tour that Levin saw her. Annabelle was sitting alone on a wooden bench in the courtyard, her white dress spotless despite the muddy ground. She was folding paper into small, precise shapes birds, by the look of them, and setting them in a neat row beside her. The moment Levin's gaze fell on her, she looked up. It was not the gaze of a child meeting a stranger for the first time. It was steady, unblinking, almost appraising. Levin felt an unexpected chill, as if he had stepped into a draft of cold air. He tried to approach, but the matron's hand tightened on his arm. "That's Annabelle," she said in a tone meant to end the conversation. They moved on before he could ask more. That night, Levin developed the photographs he had taken during the visit. Every image was clear except the one of the courtyard. The bench, the muddy ground, the background of brick walls, all were sharp. But where Annabelle had been sitting, there was only a faint blur, like a smudge on the lens. Levin checked the negative. The blur was there too. He went back the following week, this time without an appointment, hoping to catch her outside again. He saw her briefly through a second-floor window, standing perfectly still in a shaft of light. When he raised his camera, she turned her head sharply, as though sensing the motion, and stepped away. That same day, Levin found his way into the East Wing under the pretense of photographing architectural details. He located the attic stairs, almost by accident hidden behind a door marked storage. The steps creaked under his weight, the air growing colder as he climbed out at the top. The attic was dim, dust swirling in the narrow beams of light from a single window. Old furniture lay beneath moth-eaten sheets, and in the far corner, on a lone shelf, sat the wooden box. It was smaller than he had imagined, the carvings delicate and strange. Some shapes looked like flowers, others like curling waves. But the longer he stared, the more they seemed to shift, forming symbols he couldn't recognize. He reached out a hand. The sound came suddenly, a soft, deliberate step behind him. Levin froze and turned. Annabelle stood in the doorway, barefoot. Her eyes locked on him. She said nothing, but the air seemed to tighten, the room dimming slightly, as if a cloud had passed over the sun. Levin's throat went dry. Without thinking, he stepped back from the shelf. Annabelle walked forward slowly, never breaking eye contact, and placed both hands on the wooden box. Her fingers were pale and thin, but her grip on the box was firm, almost possessive. She lifted it and held it close to her chest. Levin realized then that the temperature in the attic had dropped sharply. His breath was visible in the air. She turned and left without a word. When Levin tried to follow, he found the stairwell door closed and locked. 2 days later, he woke in his hotel room with a pounding headache and a strange metallic taste in his mouth. His camera was gone. His notes from the orphanage visit were missing, though he remembered locking them in his briefcase. Levin stayed in Chicago for another week, searching for anyone willing to speak further. But those who had shown initial interest no longer returned his calls. A woman who had agreed to meet him at a diner never arrived. Later, he learned she had been admitted to hospital after collapsing at home. When he finally left the city, Levin carried only a single photograph from St. Agnes, the blurred image of the courtyard bench. In his final notes, he wrote, "There is something in that place. It is not trapped there. It chooses to stay." What he didn't know, what no one outside the orphanage ever knew, was that the attic door remained unlocked for exactly 3 days. After his visit, on the 4th morning, the matron found it shut and bolted from the inside, and Annabelle's wooden box was once again in its corner. By the early 1960s, St. Agnes had taken on an air of urban legend in Chicago's darker circles. Cab drivers swapped strange stories about late-night pickups near the orphanage gates, where a pale little girl would climb in, ride silently for several blocks, then vanish when the driver glanced back. Neighborhood children dared each other to run up and touch the front steps, though few stayed long enough to brag about it. The official line from the archdiocese was that the orphanage was a safe and nurturing environment for disadvantaged youth. Yet its funding had quietly tripled in the past decade, and several of its staff had been rotated in and out with suspicious frequency. Most of the new hires lasted less than a year. Among those who stayed was Sister Miriam, a quiet, sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who had joined in 1948 and refused promotion to matron more than once. Those who knew her described her as dutiful but withdrawn, spending much of her time in the East Wing, where Annabelle's room was located. In the winter of 1961, Sister Miriam began keeping a private record, a series of brief entries in a small notebook she concealed beneath the false bottom of a dresser drawer. They were never meant to be read outside the convent, but decades later, they would resurface and paint a chilling portrait of life inside St. Agnes. The early entries were almost clinical. December 2nd, 1961, the child remains unchanged. Her clothing never seems to soil. No appetite observed. She moves only when she wishes to be seen. Time in the chapel, none. Avoids the crucifix. The wooden box remains locked. January 14th, 1962. Frost formed inside the window panes of her room last night. Though the radiator was on high, I found a dead sparrow on the sill outside. Its eyes were missing. As the weeks passed, the tone of the entries shifted. Miriam began noting the effect Annabelle has seemed to have on others. February 6th, new cook has resigned after 1 week. She claimed the gray girl stood beside her bed at night. Sister Agnes swore the cook's door was locked from inside. March 12th, the postman refuses to enter the property. Said he heard weeping from the attic. I was in the attic at the time. There was no one there. Then, in late spring, an incident occurred that would haunt Miriam for the rest of her life. May 4th. Woke at 2:17 a.m. to the sound of footsteps outside my room. Hall was empty, but the floorboards creaked as though under weight. Cold draft present. Upon returning to my room, I found the wooden box on my desk. It was warm to the touch. Lid unlocked. She did not write what she saw inside. After that night, Miriam's handwriting became more erratic. She began skipping days, sometimes weeks, between entries. Several pages were torn out entirely. Her final note was scrawled in shaky ink. June 28th. I understand now why she does not leave. The box binds her, but only just. If it opens again, we are all undone. Miriam vanished from St. Agnes less than a month later. Officially, she requested reassignment to a remote parish, but no one in the diocese could confirm where she had gone. It was around this time that the deaths began again. Not among the children, they seemed strangely untouched, but among those who had worked there for long periods. A janitor collapsed in the boiler room, cause undetermined. A social worker was found drowned in her bathtub, though she lived alone and had no history of fainting. And a former orphanage nurse was struck by a streetcar after reportedly stepping into the road without looking. Each of these individuals had one thing in common. They had all, at some point, been assigned to the East Wing. By 1963, the orphanages. Enrollment had quietly dropped to less than half capacity, yet Annabelle remained. Always the same height, the same pale hair, the same faintly watchful gaze. She no longer appeared in group photographs, though no one could agree on when she had stopped. In some albums, the space where she would have stood seemed subtly wrong, as though the lighting didn't match, or the shadows bent slightly away from the empty spot. The attic was now strictly off limits. Staff were told it was unsafe, structurally unsound, but those who had been there before knew it was solid as stone. The lock on its door was replaced twice in a single year. Still, some nights, faint noises could be heard from above soft tapping. Like fingernails on wood. What no one knew then, not even the matron, was that Annabelle had begun visiting the attic again. Alone, in the hours before dawn, she would sit cross-legged in the dust, the wooden box before her. And sometimes, if one listened closely, there was another sound beneath the tapping, a whisper, rhythmic and low, in a language no one alive could name. By the mid-1960s, the neighborhood around St. Agnes had begun to change. Once lined with tidy brick homes and corner shops, the area slid into decline. Factories closed. Families moved away, and entire blocks stood boarded up. Yet the orphanage remained untouched by vandalism, its wrought iron fence free of graffiti, its windows unbroken. It was as if even the most reckless trespassers understood instinctively that the place was off limits. Inside, the East Wing felt colder than the rest of the building. Even in July, breath would fog faintly in its corridors. Staff assigned their work quickly, avoiding eye contact with the closed doors. The other children no longer mentioned Annabelle, whether this was due to fear, superstition, or some unspoken pressure was unclear, but to the outside world, she had ceased to exist. Only one man tried to change that. His name was Dr. Harold Kessler, a city health inspector tasked with evaluating long-term care facilities. He arrived in September 1965, carrying a leather satchel and an air of mild irritation. His inspection reports were known for their precision, every peeling paint chip noted, every questionable practice recorded. He had no patience for evasive answers. Kessler's visit to St. Agnes began routinely. He toured the kitchen, the common rooms, the infirmary. But when he asked to see the East Wing, the matron hesitated. She cited quarantine due to a mild influenza outbreak. Kessler, unimpressed, insisted on entering anyway. What happened next is known only through fragments. His written report, submitted a week later, contained a short, cryptic passage. Subject female. Apparent age 9 observed in private quarters. Physical development static. No observable pulse or respiration, yet standing. Skin temperature markedly below normal. Maintained unblinking visual contact for duration of inspection. Recommend immediate psychiatric and forensic review. The report was never filed. Before it could be processed, Kessler was found dead in his apartment, slumped at his kitchen table. Cause of death: massive cerebral hemorrhage. On the table, before him lay an empty envelope addressed to the Chicago Tribune, and beside it, a Polaroid photo that police later described only as unsuitable for public release. The photo vanished from the evidence room within weeks. After Kessler's death, the city quietly removed St. Agnes from its regular inspection schedule. On paper, it remained a functional orphanage, but in reality, it was more of a containment site. Few children were placed there anymore. Those who were tended to leave quickly adopted out with unusual speed. Annabelle, however, remained Dot by the winter of 1967. She was the only child left in the East Wing. 2 nuns rotated shifts to monitor her, though neither would stay alone in her presence for long. The wooden box was still in her room, resting on a small table. It had not been opened in years, at least, not by human hands. In early December. One of the nuns, Sister Pauline, was found in the chapel at dawn, kneeling before the altar. She was unresponsive, eyes wide open, lips moving in silent repetition. A doctor later said her mind was in a state of complete withdrawal. She remained in that condition until her death 6 months later. No one could prove it had anything to do with Annabelle. No one even tried Dot around this time. Rumors began circulating among the remaining staff about the attic. The noises, scratching, tapping, and that faint whisper had grown more frequent. One janitor swore he heard a child's laughter echoing down from above, though the attic door was locked and the key in the matron's pocket. Another claimed to see shadows moving under the door, even when no lights were on inside. On the night of December 23rd, a violent winter storm swept across the city. Power lines snapped, plunging the orphanage into darkness. The few remaining residents gathered in the common room by candlelight. No one noticed at first that Annabelle was gone. It was a young groundskeeper who later reported seeing her in the courtyard, barefoot in the snow, her nightgown billowing in the wind. She was walking toward the East Wing's service entrance, clutching the wooden box to her chest. When the storm cleared the next morning, the courtyard was empty, but the attic door stood wide open, and inside, the snow on the roof beams was streaked with what looked disturbingly like handprints. Annabelle was back in her room by breakfast, sitting cross-legged on her bed. The box was gone. From that day forward, the noises in the attic stopped. But the East Wing felt colder than ever so. Cold, in fact, that ice formed along the inside of the walls, even with the radiators running full. And anyone who stayed too long in that part of the building reported the same sensation. A dull, steady pressure behind the eyes, as though something was pressing inward from the inside of their skull. It was in this period that the orphanage's most closely guarded record was written, a short, unsigned note in the matron's files, dated January 8, 1968. The containment is no longer secure. The note in the matron's files, those 5 cryptic words, was never meant to be read outside the walls of St. Agnes. Yet somehow it did not stay hidden. In the spring of 1968, a young social worker named Margaret Dwyer was assigned to review the orphanage's adoption records for a routine audit. Margaret was new to the job, idealistic, and more importantly, thorough. She spent hours combing through dusty cabinets in the administrative office, pulling adoption certificates, medical charts, and intake forms. The records were a mess, with names crossed out, dates misfiled, and entire months missing. It was in the back of the lowest drawer that she found the note. There was no signature, no context, just the stark sentence, typed unevenly on yellowing paper. Her curiosity piqued. Margaret asked the matron what it meant. The matron, pale and visibly shaken, told her the phrase was a clerical error, and urged her to focus on other files. But Margaret couldn't let it go. Her persistence led her to the East Wing. The hallway lights flickered as she walked, and she noticed the air growing colder the farther she went. She counted the doors, most locked, and stopped outside one that looked recently repainted. It bore no nameplate, just a tarnished number. 6. Inside, Annabelle sat on the bed, staring at the wall. She did not turn her head, even when Margaret spoke her name. Her skin was the color of candle wax, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Margaret was immediately struck by the fact that she looked exactly like the photograph on her 1923 intake form. A picture taken 45 years earlier. Margaret left the room quickly, shaken, but telling herself it must be a trick of the light. That night, she began compiling a private dossier on Annabelle, pulling any records she could find. The deeper she dug, the stranger the details became. Every staff member who had worked directly with Annabelle for more than 6 months had either transferred, resigned suddenly, or died. Her file contained multiple birth dates, none consistent with each other. Medical examinations listed her as both alive and non-responsive to standard biological metrics. In the same report, Margaret decided to copy the most damning documents, slipping them into a manila folder to take home. She never made it that far. On April 17th, her body was found in her apartment. No signs of forced entry, no indication of a struggle. Her heart had simply stopped. The manila folder was gone, and the official cause of death was listed as natural causes. She was 32 years old. Within days, the remaining staff at St. Agnes received a memo from the Archdiocese. The East Wing was to be sealed. Annabelle would be moved to a private care facility. The location was not disclosed, but that transfer never happened. Weeks later, a violent incident occurred, details of which were scrubbed from all official accounts, but whispers persisted among former staff. According to one custodian, a priest from the Archdiocese came to bless the East Wing before the move. Halfway through the ritual, every light in the building went out. Witnesses claimed the temperature dropped to below freezing, and in the darkness, something began knocking on the walls from inside the sealed room, slow at first, then faster, until it sounded like dozens of fists pounding in unison. When the lights returned, the priest was gone. In his place, lying on the cold stone floor of the hallway, was the wooden box. No one dared to open it. From that day onward, Annabelle was never mentioned in any official capacity again. The matron referred to her as the resident when forced to speak of her all. The East Wing was locked completely, and the rest of the orphanage continued to operate as if that section of the building didn't exist. But outside those walls, something else was happening. Margaret Dwyer's estranged brother Patrick began asking questions about her death. He didn't believe the natural causes explanation. He retraced her steps, visited St. Agnes under the guise of a volunteer, and quickly sensed there was something deeply wrong with the building. His investigation would lead him somewhere. No one was meant to go into the sealed East Wing and into the truth that had been hidden there for almost half a century. Patrick Dwyer had never intended to become a detective. A former police officer with a sharp mind and a stubborn streak, he was driven more by grief and suspicion than by any official mandate. When his sister Margaret died under mysterious circumstances, he vowed to uncover the truth, even if it meant walking straight into the heart of darkness. His first obstacle was St. Agnes itself. Officially, the orphanage was off limits to outsiders, especially since the East Wing had been sealed by the Archdiocese months earlier. But Patrick was nothing if not resourceful. With a forged volunteer ID and the casual confidence of someone who had walked city streets at all hours, he gained entry one rainy afternoon in early June 1968. The orphanage smelled of damp wood, old stone, and faintly of incense. Most of the children kept to themselves, wary of the newcomers. Staff eyed him with thinly veiled suspicion, but no one stopped him outright. He asked vague questions, watched the comings and goings, and studied the locked doors that led to the East Wing. Over several days, he learned that the East Wing was not only sealed from the rest of the building, but also had its own security. Measures alarms, locked gates, and cameras installed by an unknown party. It was as if the place was less an orphanage wing and more a prison. Patrick managed to find a janitor willing to talk, an older man named Sam, whose hands trembled as he spoke. Sam told him stories of strange noises, whispers in the dead of night, footsteps pacing empty halls, and sometimes a low humming that no one could explain. "There's something in that wing," Sam whispered. something that shouldn't be there. Patrick's determination only grew. One night, he returned after hours, sneaking into the building through a side entrance left unlocked by mistake. The orphanage was silent, except for the steady drip of water somewhere deep within the walls. Guided by Sam's directions, Patrick approached the heavy metal door that led to the east wing. The cold hit him first like walking into a freezer. His breath came out in clouds. The lock was simple, and with a few tools borrowed from his police days, he had it open in minutes. Inside, the hallway was dimly lit by emergency lights. The walls were lined with peeling paint and old portraits, their faces worn away by time. At the far end, a door marked 6 stood slightly ajar. Trick pushed it open. The room was stark and cold, illuminated by the weak glow of a single bulb. At its center sat a figure on a wooden chair, Annabelle Gray. She looked exactly as she had decades before, a pale girl with wide, unchanging eyes and pale hair that seemed almost luminescent in the dim light. In her lap rested the wooden box, its carvings faintly glowing with a strange, almost hypnotic light. As Patrick stepped closer, Annabelle slowly lifted the lid. From inside, a cold mist rose, filling the room with a biting chill. Patrick felt a sudden pressure in his head, like 1,000 whispers trying to speak all at once. Images flashed behind his eyes, visions of frozen lakes, endless winters, and a vast darkness stretching beneath the ice. He saw faces, some familiar, some twisted and unrecognizable, trapped beneath the surface. Annabelle's gaze locked onto his, and for a moment he felt as if she were looking through him, into the very depths of his soul. The box emitted a low hum, and Patrick realized the whispers were coming from it, not voices, but something else. A language older than words, older than time. Suddenly, Annabelle closed the box and stood. The temperature in the room rose abruptly, the cold retreating as she moved toward the door. Patrick followed, heart pounding. As they reached the hallway, alarms began to blare. The door slammed shut behind him, locking him inside. Trapped, Patrick could hear footsteps approaching. The whispers grew louder, overwhelming his thoughts. Outside the locked door, distant voices called his name, but he could not answer. And somewhere deep in the orphanage, Annabelle walked free, carrying the wooden box close to her chest. Patrick's heart hammered as he pounded against the cold metal door, the shrill wail of the alarm echoing through the empty corridors. The freezing air wrapped around him like a suffocating shroud, each breath sharp and painful. His mind swirled with the visions the wooden box had forced upon him. Endless ice, trapped souls beneath a frozen lake, a darkness that stretched into eternity. He couldn't tell how long he was trapped inside that room. Time seemed to bend, seconds stretching into minutes, minutes into hours. The whispers filled his ears relentlessly, voices not spoken in any language he had ever known, a siren song that threatened to drown his sanity. Outside, footsteps approached, slow, deliberate, unhurried. Patrick's breath caught in his throat. As the door's lock clicked, the heavy door creaked open, revealing the matron and 2 nuns, faces pale but resolute. They did not speak, but gestured for him to come. He staggered out, clutching his head as the voices finally receded. The matron led him down a long hallway lined with peeling wallpaper and faded photographs. "Why?" Patrick managed to whisper. "Why hide her? What is she?" The matron looked away. "She is not what you think. She is something older, something bound by the box, and if it breaks, we all suffer." They reached a small chapel at the heart of the orphanage. The matron pulled open a concealed panel behind the altar, revealing a narrow stairwell descending into darkness. "Come," she said. Patrick followed, every step echoing into the blackness. The stairwell opened into a vast underground chamber. Stone walls glistened with moisture, and in the center, stood a frozen pool of water, its surface cracked but solid. Annabelle was there, standing at the pool's edge, the wooden box open beside her. The cold mist from the box rose, swirling into shapes' faces contorted in pain, mouths open in silent screams. Eyes pleading for release, the matron knelt by the pool and began chanting softly in Latin, her voice steady despite the cold that bit at her skin. The chamber seemed to respond. The ice rippled, the faces faded, and the whispers lessened. Patrick understood then. Annabelle was a guardian, bound to contain whatever lay beneath the frozen pool. The wooden box was a seal, an anchor holding back an ancient darkness that could consume everything if unleashed. But the price was high. Annabelle herself was trapped, never aging, never free. Her presence in the orphanage was both prison and protection. The matron's voice grew firmer as she continued the chant. The cold began to retreat, warmth slowly returning to the chamber. Annabelle closed the box and turned to Patrick. Her eyes held a sadness beyond words. "You must leave," the matron said, her tone final. "This is not a place for outsiders." Patrick nodded, heart heavy with the weight of what he had seen. As he ascended the stairs, he glanced back once more. Annabelle stood alone beside the frozen pool, eternal, unchanging, bound to a fate beyond comprehension. Back in the world above, the orphanage looked ordinary once again. The sealed east wing remained locked, its secrets buried deep beneath stone and ice. Patrick never spoke of what he had found. The police wrote off his sudden resignation from the force as burnout. Friends noticed his withdrawn demeanor but said nothing. Yet, in quiet moments, he could still hear the whispers, the language older than time calling from beneath the frozen lake. Years passed after Patrick's departure from Chicago, and St. Agnes Orphanage slowly faded from memory, swallowed by the relentless march of time and urban redevelopment. The old brick building stood abandoned for decades, its windows shattered, walls covered in graffiti, and the once pristine courtyard choked with weeds. Yet beneath the rubble, the secrets of the East Wing remained untouched, preserved in frozen silence. Despite the passage of time, the legend of the girl who never grew old persisted in hushed conversations among locals. Stories circulated of a pale child seen wandering near the ruins at dusk, her eyes reflecting an otherworldly glow. Clutching a wooden box, no one dared approach in the early 1980s. A team of historians and paranormal investigators gained access to the dilapidated structure, hoping to uncover the truth behind the rumors. Their photographs of the East Wing revealed icy patterns on the walls, frost lingering despite the heat of summer. Audio recordings captured faint, indecipherable whispers and the soft tapping of what sounded like fingernails on wood, but the investigators found no sign of Annabelle. One afternoon, as the team explored the basement level, a sudden collapse sealed off part of the underground chamber Patrick had described decades earlier. When the dust settled, no one could reach the frozen pool again. It was as if the building itself had reclaimed its deepest secret. Over time, the orphanage was demolished to make way for a new residential complex. The site was landscaped, the earth layered over and packed tight. Construction crews reported occasional strange cold spots and equipment malfunctions, but these were dismissed as anomalies. Yet, on quiet nights, residents living near the former orphanage's grounds sometimes speak of a child's laughter carried on the wind. Some swear they see a pale figure standing at the edge of the tree line, her gaze fixed on the horizon, clutching a wooden box that glows faintly under the moonlight. Annabelle Gray, the girl who never grew old, remains a living enigma prisoner and protector of an ancient darkness sealed beneath frozen waters. Her story, lost to most but whispered among those who dare to remember, is a chilling reminder of the price of secrets and the shadows lurking beneath the surface of forgotten places. And though decades have passed, the question remains: what happens when the seal finally breaks? The years following the demolition of St. Agnes Orphanage have done little to quell the dark legacy embedded in its soil. Beneath the gleaming new buildings and manicured lawns, the ancient curse endures, wrapped in silence and frozen whispers. Occasionally, descendants of those once connected to the orphanage report strange phenomena, dreams of endless winter nights, faces pressed beneath ice, and a haunting lullaby sung in a language no living person understands. The wooden box, lost to time and memory, has never been found, yet it remains a symbol of the unseen chains that bind Annabelle Gray. Modern scholars who stumble across fragments of the story are left with more questions than answers. Some propose that Annabelle was never truly human, but a vessel or guardian for an otherworldly entity imprisoned beneath the orphanage. Others suggest she was a living curse, a bridge between our world and a forgotten realm of cold shadows and ancient horrors. Regardless of theory, the evidence is chilling. A child who never ages, a series of mysterious deaths, a locked east wing harboring a secret frozen lake, and a wooden box inscribed with shifting, indecipherable symbols. Most haunting of all is the realization that the darkness Annabelle guarded is not gone. It waits, patient and bound beneath layers of stone and ice, sealed by a fragile human will. And the girl who never grew old? She remains, forever trapped between time and eternity, a silent sentinel in the endless winter of her own making. As the night deepens and cold winds whisper through forgotten streets, one question lingers in the air, unanswered, unsettling, and eternal. What will happen when the seal finally breaks and the frozen darkness is set free? The story of Annabelle Gray is not just a tale of mystery and horror. It is a warning. Some secrets are buried for a reason, and some guardians never rest. Will you dare to remember?